In today's video, we're going to be showing you a simple HTTP and URL example. Let's start with a couple of definitions here. First, HTTP, which stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP. It's used all over the internet and specifically the web. It's not just used for web pages. It's used in a lot of different communications that go on, data transfers, all sorts of things. And it really started at the beginning of the internet. It wasn't too long after the internet was formed that that this whole protocol was created, and it became kind of the underpinning of the World Wide Web, which, by the way, is what www stands for. So it's, again, very extensively used. So then let's also talk about a URL. So URLs are things like google.com, www.google.com, and so forth. Your browser actually lets you type in a little bit, and then it creates the URL for you just to be easy. Back in the old days, it did not do that. A real URL should be something like, it should look something like this. HTTP, gotta have a dot there. There we go, something like this. That's a URL. They can have a question and about, they can have all sorts of stuff that's on there, but it's basically what you would type into a browser or a link that you click on a browser that goes to another link. That's a URL. So in Java, we have libraries that deal with HTTP and deal with URLs. And so we're going to use those. We're going to take a string that represents a URL and create a real URL out of it in Java using the library. And we're then going to make a connection using HTTP with that URL. Then we're going to do some more things to it to kind of teach you how it works. So HTTP is really, for the most part, it is a request and response language. You send a request, you get a response. We'll learn a lot more about HTTP when we start talking about the topic of servlets, because servlets implement the HTTP protocol under the covers, and they kind of make it easy for you to use, and it has some additional features. There's a lot that it can do, but under the covers, it's HTTP. So let's start with our simple class, and we're going to create a method, and we're going to go from there. So let's start here. Now, I don't usually use static methods, but in this case, I'm going to do that. So we're going to go public static. We're going to call this get HTTP content, and we're going to take in a parameter. We're going to of a string, and we're going to call it string just to be simple. Okay. Now we want our new method to also return a string back to the calling line of code. That makes sense. So with this in mind, then let's start thinking about what we want to do here. So we're going to start by using a class in Java called URL, where let's call it the object that is instantiated URL, just to be creative. And then we're going to use the collector, we're going to use the constructor, there's the word, to instantiate it, and we'll pass a string. We're actually passing this same string that gets passed in as a parameter. Those are the same. And then we're going to also create an HTTP connection using, again, a class like this. Let's call it HTTP. And then we're going to use from the URL method object a method called open connection. But we want this to return we want this to return an HTTP URL connection type. That's because this is a URL is actually a parent or a superclass of the class HTTP URL connection. All right, everything's in red. What's going on? Well, what's going on is that we need to add a couple of imports. So let's start by importing to java.net asterisk and java.io asterisk. So part of this whole connection stuff is about it's about I/O, inputs and outputs. It's about data flowing back and forth, and so we'll use that. Let's see. Not sure why these are still a problem. They should be okay now. So URL string. Yep, everything looks good. Okay, so the reason why they're still in red is because with a lot of I/O type things, we need to be able to handle an exception that might come up. So we're going to put a try here, and we're going to put a catch here. Can't type right. There we go. Now I like to always use the lowest level exception possible. And for this, it's IO exception. We'll call it E. And then I always put something in the catch like this. And we'll just print out the data of the exception. That'll help us to troubleshoot if we encounter something. Okay. All right. So here we've made a connection with the URL. Now we have to do something with it. Well, the thing is that the data we're going to get back could be 1 line, could be 100 lines, could be more than that. We don't really know. And those lines are going to come back in the form of a string, each line as a separate string. So we're going to manage this, we're going to use what's called a string builder, which is a little more efficient than just concatenating a string. We'll call it string builder. Okay, now with string builder, rather than instantiate using the constructor like we did here, it actually has a method that will do the construction. So we do it, actually that's on one that comes up here. So hold on to that thought. With this one, we're just going to use the standard. Like that. Okay. Now we also need to use something to read the data, and it's similar in some ways to reading the data off of a file, or reading the data off of the keyboard while you're typing, or those kinds of things. We'll be using basically the same type of objects to do it. Buffer reader. Buffer. And we're going to be using an input string reader that gets an input string. So let's do that. And HTTP, there's our connection, get input stream. So that gets us connects with a stream, and now allows us to go forward. By the way, this is buffer ed reader. Ed, there we go. So what this is basically going to do is set up with this connection, set up an input stream. Now we need to read that input stream line by line, and we don't know how many there are, so we're going to have to use a while loop here. And the while loop, then once we've set that up, we're going to take our string builder and keep adding to that string builder until we're done. So, but we need to account for a single line like this. And then inside we have to decide how do we get to how do we know we're at the end? So we're going to do two things at once. We are going to read the line and then check the line to see if it's the last one. Okay, so we're going to go line equals reader. That's from our buffered reader. Read line. And then we're going to test to see if it's not equal to null. We want it to keep going until it's null. So then it would be false, and then it would drop through the while loop. And it actually wouldn't, so when the line gets to be null, it's not going to add that null line to the string builder. It's just going to proceed to the next. So inside here is where we really need to handle, we're reading it here, but now we need to handle it. So we're going to go string builder. We're going to use the append method here, and we're going to be adding to this the line, but we also want to add a /n. And what that will do is that's going to put a carriage return or a new line return on the end of each of those that we build, so that when you print them, it's going to have an end for each of them rather than it just being one big continuous thing. Now sometimes when you look at a web page, it actually doesn't have any returns in it anyway, so it's still going to kind of look that way, but that's all right. All right. Once we have finished, we will have the full amount of the content from this connection, and it will be in this string builder. And so now we're going to simply return the string builder as a toString. And that's going to return it back to the calling line in your program. Now, what do we do if it hits a catch here? It's going to skip all this. It won't return anything. Well, we're simply going to just return a string here that says error. So they'll already kind of know because they're going to get the printout of the exception, but that will kind of clean things up for us. All right. Now, we're going to create a main here. And the main, I like to build classes where we're basically using the main to just test in most cases. So we're going to test this method out simply by using a print string, because we want to and print line. It's a rough one today. All right, and so we're going to just print out the content that we get here. So let's call it, of course it's static, so we need to use the class name, HTTP example, and then the content. Now it's asking us for a parameter. This parameter here is the URL, right? HTTP www.google.com. It can be whatever you want to put in there. Now, if we run this and we run the main, we're going to see what happens here. Dun, 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 dun. All right, so look what we got. We ended up with a whole bunch of gibberish, which is basically a combination here of HTTP or HTML and JavaScript is basically what we have. But that's exactly what, if you were to go to google.com, right-click, view the source on the page, you would get the same exact thing we just got right here. Now, this is great, but HTTP returns more than just this content. It also can return something called headers. And so we're going to write another method that will handle the headers. So let's start with that one. It's a little bit simpler. The method at least is. So let's call it, again, public static. Let's call this one get HTTP headers. Just like the last one, we're going to use this string variable parameter, got to have an R in there, to pass the URL, but this one is going to return a map. And you might remember from when we talked about collections that a map is one of these things that we can use to store data. The map, just when it says map here, it's actually a interface, but we have to add the import for it to know what the heck to do. And we'll use the util here. Okay, so you can see actually when this shows up here that it's an interface. So you'll learn more about those as you go along. Okay, so it's going to return a map. So let's, we know we're dealing with I/O again here. So let's do a try catch just like we had on the other one. We're going to need to do that anyway. I/O exception. Print line e dot toString. All right. Well, all right. Let's keep her going here. So what we're going to do is we're going to do exactly the same thing we did right here. We're going to set up a URL. We're going to establish a connection. Those are pretty easy. But now we need to get the headers. So this is simple. We're just going to return them. To return HTTP dot get headers. Now that will return the headers in the form of a map back to the calling line in your application. What do we do with the catch? Well, rather, we're going to return null. We're going to return nothing. Of course, we're going to know already because we're going to see the exception that's there. All right. So now we've got to test this. This is going to be a little more tricky. And the reason why it's going to be a little more tricky is because we need to deal with the map. And what I mean by that is we've got to take this map like you would any collection, and if we're going to print it out, we need to kind of go through it line by line to print it out, right? So let's first establish a map here. And a map is made up of two pieces, a key and a value pair. There are a key and a value, okay? The key is an integer, and the value is a list. So it could actually be a collection in and of itself. It would be a collection in itself. Okay. So we set it up like this. We're going to use M here. So the thing I said a while back that I was just a little ahead of myself on is that when you instantiate one of these maps, you use this method here we're going to return. All right. HTTP example, just like we did above it, except this time we're calling get HTTP headers, and we're going to actually pass the same thing. I'm going to just copy it from right here and put it right there. Okay, now at this point in our program, as we're testing, we now have a map with all the headers for this URL. Well, we could say, yeah, that's good enough, but we kind of want to print them. And so we want to print them, and we need to print them like one line at a time. So rather than use a while loop or our typical for loop, I'm going to use what we sometimes call a for each loop, just to give you a little flavor for it. And the for loop starts with the first element being the individual line. And so we have to define it just like we did above, and it uses this method called entry. And so entry takes an integer and a list, like that. And we're going to call this thing entry because it's the line entry. And then we put a colon, and then we put, basically let's dump the map in there. And we dump the map in there using M because that's the object we created. And inside M is a method called entry set. Okay. All right. Now we're going to loop through here. And one of the great things about using this for loop is we can use this entry object basically because it represents a map line, one line in the map each time we go around. So let's print it out. And so let's call this key equals, gotta spell it right, huh? Equals, and let's put entry get key. That'll share us the key. And then let's say value equals, and then let's print same thing entry, but this is get value. All right. So for each time we go through that, it's just going to print the key and the value, the two together. All right. So let's give this a shot and see what we end up with. We're going to run it here. Okie dokie. So we got the same stuff above as we had before. That's the content part of it. And then the headers are listed here. So you've got a lot of interesting stuff here. Something that's really interesting that maybe you haven't seen much is here are the cookies that are on this site. Cookies are part of the header. So there's lots of interesting stuff there. Sometimes there's a lot more, but you're able to get with this HTTP, the URL class and the HTTP URL connection class, you're able to go out, make a connection using HTTP and bring the data back. So I hope this is going to help you as you start to work on the assignment for this week.